MBA students, what we're going to be providing you today is with a very basic catch-up for the lecture from 3/24/21 because I failed to record the lecture. We talked about public and private key encryption. Public key means we're both using or asymmetric public and private key encryption means we've got a public and a private key. We can encode things using a public key, but only the person holding the private key can decrypt something. Symmetric key encryption means we both got access to the same key, which we can use to encode and decode. The problem with that particular type of simple encryption is once the single key is out, everybody has access to that information. What we're talking about with public key cryptography and digital signatures is the idea of really doing encryption inside of encryption. So again, what we're essentially doing is encrypting and using multiple keys. Let's look at the description from our text. A hash function essentially is encryption. So we're initially using some kind of encryption to turn our original message into ones and zeros. At that point, we're including both our public and private key into what we refer to as a ciphertext. So we're encrypting the original message. We're then using our public and private keys together as encryption tools that are put together in the ciphertext. So we can guarantee at some level our public and private keys are both included. That's sent over the internet when they get to our recipient, essentially, because we've encrypted this with our own public key. Our recipient can use the private key to open what we have sent them, very similar to public-private key encryption. By applying the same hash function, they can decode this. The long and short of it, outside of all the complications of a system like this, is that we're using encryption at the front before we encrypt it using public and private key encryption. So this also can be further applied to something we refer to as digital envelopes, which are essentially, again, encryption within encryption. And it's best just to illustrate this. Essentially, what we're doing in this particular type of setting, as opposed to a hash function, we're using what we refer to as a symmetric session key. And what that means is essentially that we are using a limited time key for both the encryption and decryption as well as standard public-private key encryption. So we've got the recipient's public key and private key that are used like we would in typical public-private key encryption, but we're also using another symmetric session key which is generated temporarily for one of these sessions. Could somebody else have access to this? Yes, because it's a symmetric key. It's just adding one additional layer of keyed encryption. So again, you'd be making a symmetric key specific for one section, have a limited time frame. Sometimes, for example, when we're doing this, you can see, for example, the email exercise we're doing this week that requires an SMS text is very similar in concept, that it's a limited time key to get into the email or into the message. So it's the idea of creating a digital envelope. And then we get into what we refer to as digital certificates and public key infrastructure. This is going to be, again, an oversimplification, but a digital certificate means you've got a third party who's essentially making sure that they're validating the security of a site. So we can use public key infrastructures with these groups called certifying authorities or certificate authorities. Essentially, you're relying on a third party to audit the interactions and communications between customers and companies or between multiple entities. If we're using a certifying authority such as VeriSign, so essentially we're verifying that the public keys that are being issued are legitimate, and we're accessing, or the private keys is held by that third party. So we're using a third party to help validate our transactions. Here's a pretty good illustration of how this would work. If I'm going out, for example, to a particular company, if I'm going out to make a purchase, for example, I would have a public key that would allow me to get into the transaction, but the private key would be verified by a third party. So by having a username and a logon, for example, I in essence am getting a public key by logging on. The certifying or certificate or certification authority, I should say, is providing the private key for the back end encryption. The long and short of it is we're using a third party to verify the entire communication. So what are some of the limitations of this? Well, you're relying on somebody to to store the private key in the first place. And if you got insiders, whether it's folks who work for the certification authority or certificate authority or for the actual company, they still have access to that private key and can redistribute it. The biggest disadvantage, though, and again, this is a vast oversimplification, is that the certifying authorities or certificate authorities themselves are essentially self-policing. There's no universal standard for these, and they are organizations that are basically building their trustworthiness on the fact that people are doing business with them, and over time, they sometimes can become complacent. So what are other ways we can physically secure networks? And again, oversimplifications, but we have physical security in terms of things such as secure socket layer or transport security layer. It means that we're putting encryption in other areas of the network. Remember, we talked about the various layers of IP communications or network communications. Well, this place we're taking it down to transport layer and encrypting those layers of the communication. You get a virtual private network, which essentially means you are creating a tunnel within the internet that is making remote users appear as though they are part of your network. And then we can actually get into encryption on our wireless networks as well. And common standards include WPA2 and 3. And that stands for Wireless Protected Access. So in terms of how this works, again, if we are doing, as opposed to using a certifying authority, if we're actually doing encryption between a client and a server, or client and a company themselves, we are requesting a session. We are getting a certificate back and forth. We've got a session key essentially that says during this session the communications will be somewhat secure. And again, that can be a symmetric key, or we could get into public-private key encryption as well. And not to oversimplify, but essentially we're guaranteeing some level of security during those sections. I'm going to be sending out a video to you about what Heartbleed is all about, but SSL itself can actually get compromised. If the public and private keys are compromised, or in this case, secure socket layer, if we're led to believe, if computers are tricked into believing that a session that is secure is actually not, and information is being siphoned off, unbeknownst to the user. How do I want to phrase this? If you go between a client and a server, and the actual certificate or the keys that are being exchanged, the symmetric keys that are being exchanged have been compromised, they can't put information out to a third party. And that's essentially what happened with Heartbleed. I'll be sending that video to you as well. Again, we're going very quickly here, but a firewall essentially is a way for guaranteeing what kind of information comes in and out of an organization. Firewalls can filter specific kinds of content. Some of the things that they're very famous for example, firewall can filter out exe files. EXEs are things that by no means do you want to download if they're coming from an unknown source, because EXEs can install software. We can also have what we refer to as application gateways, which can ensure that certain types of applications that could be damaging to computers or our network are not allowed to pass through the firewall. We can also use what we refer to as proxy servers, which means essentially you're relaying inside and outside the network to a server that's outside the network to be able to allow you to communicate while keeping integrity on your own network. So again, proxy server is very similar to a firewall. Then we get into intrusion detection and prevention systems, which are essentially ways we can verify somebody has been in our network and to be able to hopefully keep them from getting in. So again, firewalls act as filters. Proxy servers tend to filter inside and outside as well. A proxy server, for all intents and purposes, can also serve as a firewall. Again, the easiest ways to protect your network and your components are to do your upgrades and patches, as we saw, for example, when we got into the whole Equifax problem. If somebody had been on the ball with installing patches for Adobe Stacks, for example, we may have never been talking about Equifax in the news. And keeping your antivirus up to date is also important as well. Then we get into public laws, for example. This can be really tough because there are no universal standards for security, although there are movements within the law for things like Sarbanes-Oxley for companies to be more accountable for whether or not they secure information. When it comes right down to it, at this point in time, there's not one law that says how you need to protect information. Different industries have different laws. For example, HIPAA. For the healthcare industry, although it recommends best practices, there's no universal standards of of encryption or protection that you need to abide by. Meaning, for companies, you got to take your best stab at being as secure as you can to be able to have an effective security policy and hardware in place. Because if your data gets compromised, somebody's probably coming to sue you, and the amount of damages and the way that a judge rules for or against you is probably going to be based largely on how seriously you took the threats in the first place. So in terms of how we do this stuff, again, a risk assessment says, where are our problems? Where are our areas where we could be compromised? If you've got open areas with computers with open access to your network, like many colleges do, for example, that's a point of risk. You need to have a security policy that people are educated on and follow. And again, I recommend having a security organization. When I used to run an IT department, for example, we had a security group that met every 2 weeks to talk about threats and how we should be addressing them. What about access controls? Do you have physical access restrictions to certain areas of your hardware or your network, or actually getting into a computer? What about authorization procedures? Are people required to log onto your network? Are you requiring some kind of biometrics? And what about other ways of managing network? Are you running Active Directory and controlling who has access to what? And how often are you checking your security settings? Again, this is a cyclical process. Just because you did a security audit once doesn't mean you're done. It's a process that runs in a loop. In terms of whether or not biometrics are secure, I think there's a pretty good argument to be made that most people, or a lot of people these days, would rather not have to remember 200 passwords in exchange for using their thumbprint. These are, again, are areas where there have been public policies that have come into play. For example, we have a constant tug of war between government oversight and independence of industry. And what it really comes down to most of the time is the government gets involved when companies create encryption standards that the government can't crack. Generally speaking, the government does not like companies having encryption or security that is beyond their reach, as we have seen with Apple. Protocols, or I should say laws, like the USA Patriot Act and Homeland Security Act, for example, reduce the amount of paperwork that was required to be able to get into secure systems. And again, we do have a lot of public-private cooperation, because the public writ large wants secure data, and private companies want to be able to give that to them. In the United States, for whatever reason, we still are in love with credit cards. They're the largest source of online spending, and they can also be a limiter in social equity. What do I mean by that? If you can't get credit, you probably also are unable to get a credit card, which means you may be limited from participating in the e-commerce economy. That's why so many people are advocates of other kinds of spending, such as cryptocurrency or even accrued balance systems. How does a credit card transaction work? And after you get a secure connection to your merchant, whether you're buying from Amazon or eBay or wherever you're buying from, the merchant has to go to a credit clearinghouse, which ultimately ties back to a bank. So we've got multiple layers of interaction that have to take place before you're able to actually have a transaction validated. Another limiting factor of using credit cards online is many people who don't have good credit, again, can't get a bank-backed credit card. Then we get into what we refer to as new kinds of payment systems. For example, online stored value means people can pay each other directly without having to have a credit card. PayPal is a great example, so is Venmo. And more people are using alternative payment systems such as Amazon, Visa Pay, and Dwolla in other parts of the world as well. And that's where we left off for the day, guys. I apologize for the inconvenience of having to have you watch this very brief YouTube lecture, but I thank you for your time and attention.